A little bit about Brooklyn for Peace. We have been working in Brooklyn since 1984, which makes and marks our 40th anniversary. Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustice which lead to war. We are primary an educational organization. However, we see active response to injustice as a vital component of our activities, which we hope will contribute to building a strong peace and justice movement, which is so needed at this present time.
I'm really delighted to welcome Katrina vanden Heuvel, speaker for this evening's webinar. As editorial director and publisher of The Nation, she is known to most of you. Between 1995 to 2019, Katrina was actually the magazine editor, as well as a frequent commentator on Democracy Now!, ABC, MSNBC, CNN. And I was looking through the list. I couldn't find Fox anywhere. I don't know. What a sad thing. She's written in multiple publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, was a weekly columnist for the Washington Post, which is, I think, especially valuable because it was really often the lone voice amidst the unnatural consensus. She's the author of several books, including a volume she co-authored with her late husband, historian Stephen Cohen, Voices of Glasnost, interviews with Gorbachev's reformers. Katrina has been recognized for her journalism and public service by numerous groups, among them the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, the Progressive Congress, and she serves on numerous boards, including, very importantly, the Quincy Institute and the Institute of Policy Studies. So much for the formal listing of her accomplishments, which could, of course, be much longer. What I really want to recognize tonight is Katrina's heroic role in keeping alive an ongoing critique of U.S. relations with Russia and the sabotage of post-Cold War hopes. This topic of Ukraine, Russia, the U.S. Militarized involvement. This is not new. The enormously accelerated U.S. militarized involvement in the world, and also the changes in nuclear policy. These topics have not been popular for a long time, and not even among progressives, where there's been a lot of disagreements even within our own organization. And really, even before the Middle East catastrophe distracted people's attention, there really was a reluctance to get involved in all this. But Katrina has never lost focus on this. In her own writing and in her role as president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russian Accord, she has kept challenging the conventional wisdom and offering an alternative vision and a vehicle for people who have an alternative vision of what's happening in the world. And I might just mention in passing that, as many of you know, in our newsletter that we put out every week, we have, articles on various topics that are important. And a major source of those articles is actually come from Katrina's organization. Sometimes that's not recognized as a service, but it's actually incredibly important to have material that people can use and can use very readily. So really, for all of these reasons, thank you for your work, Katrina, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Rusty, thank you so much. I feel I can just go right now.
The first question that was asked was when you mentioned a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. What do you see as the main basis for such a settlement? What more or less would it look like?
So I would suggest to people they go back and look at the 5 or 6 negotiation outlines that have been in place since 2022. As I said earlier, just a month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in Istanbul, there was a template. It often had to do with land, the issue of seizure of land, who that would belong to, sovereignty, but it also extended to language, it extended to religion, it extended to education, it extended to making sure that in the absence of having nuclear weapons, which were very obsolete, by the way, the Hungarian Budapest memo in '94, which is often cited, where I mentioned Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine disposed through US involvement of their weapons, nuclear weapons. They were, the cost of maintaining those weapons, the cost of refurbishing them was something Ukraine couldn't have done. But the main thing is that there have been 5 different efforts, at least, often overseen by Europe, not the United States, that could lead the way. And I think the war weariness, this serious war weariness on both sides, could sustain at this stage a negotiated outcome, which was not possible a year ago.
Okay, the next question, excuse me, asks about the nation itself, and it goes something like this. How much pushback, I guess, if any, do you face from your colleagues at the nation and elsewhere when you try to present evidence about U.S. provocations in Ukraine? The nation seems slow to present evidence that, say, Jeffrey Sachs and Dennis Kucinich present.
Oh, no, I mean, listen, first of all, I've been going through files. My late husband was writing about Ukraine and interference and Russia, US-Russian, US-Ukrainian relations. And by the way, he had been Sovieticus. He'd been a correspondent and columnist for Victor Navatsky before my time. He was at The Nation. And he was so prescient. His last book, of course, was called War with Russia, ? And he never had a chance to take that off. And in fact, one of the issues is it's not just war with Russia, it's war with the West. I think The Nation has been, for a liberal left progressive magazine, has, unlike any other of that caliber, been out there as much, to the point where there was a rebellion inside The Nation because there was a group of people who thought that it was all pro-Trump raising these issues about the need for better relations with Russia. And one of my colleagues leaked a letter to the Washington Post. We had a real fracas. And I had to resolve that there would be differences of views. I think the Steele dossier, I think Russiagate, as it's become known, was a tragedy because it led people to ignore our own pathologies and focus on abroad. It also led to name calling and smearing of people a la McCarthyism. When your spouse, who's an informed professor at Princeton and has been visiting Russia and speaking to scholars for 50 years, is called a Putin puppet, you know you're not doing very well in terms of discourse. So I think Russiagate is one of the great tragedies. And we seem to know more and more that when Hillary Clinton lost, the shock of losing to Trump was such. And I agree, we were shocked, so many of us. But to actually resort to calling it Russian intervention, all countries intervene in other countries' business. I mean, at levels. I'm not apologizing for it, but I'm just saying I don't think it's been a very healthy time for this country. And Russia became Trump, became Putin, Putin became Trump. Putin, by the way, The Nation, when Putin came to power in 2000, wrote that he had authoritarian tendencies. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times thought he'd be a good Democrat like Yeltsin. And his first act in power, Putin's, was to give immunity to the Yeltsin family. And the oligarchs thought they could play footsie with him. He then created his own set of oligarchs, but it's a much more complicated history than is understood or discussed in this country primarily.
Hey, I was so anxious to ask some of the very good questions people have. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Bruce Oldfield. I'm a co-vice chair of Brooklyn for Peace. An interesting question. Somebody seems to have done a survey of the audience and discovered that we're an older crowd. and wanted to know what can be done to get younger people more interested in peace issues like this.
First of all, don't denigrate older people. I don't know if that's the one root of it. I don't know what's happened, by the way, to Bill McKibben's group, which he started, which was like old codgers or codgers. I mean, the nation's demographic online is 24 to 35. The print is my age, and I just joined Medicare. But I think older people have time. Older people have passions. But it is the case that the nuclear issue is not engaging people who, for example, were in the park in 1982. Some of it, I think, is because when the Soviet Union ended, people thought we were safer, when in fact not. There are other nuclear powers, including Israel. But it's been quieted down. And I also think for younger people, an active shooter in their school is more frontally threatening. Or I was going to say, there's Reverend Barber, Poor People's, he's relaunched the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm blanking on, Pastor Mike, who's on the board of Quincy, who's in Oakland. I mean, the pathologies that run through our school system, through communities, the poverty, the policing, the school to, the police pipeline in schools. These are issues that I think can be connected to the militarization of our lives. But it is the case that people have gone kind of quiet, and climate crisis became more something people attuned to. That's why I think there's a fusion that could happen that would be valuable, not to silo the climate from the nuclear.
Somebody has asked related to that question and suggested, how about framing the issue as a kitchen table issue? A Patriot missile could pay for a school.
Oh, I mean, this has been done. This is why.
Oh, yeah, we've done it too.
No, I know. And the question is, how can we move it? Everyone on this call has, heard Bill Hartung, who's at Quincy now, or others speak of what could be purchased, like a carrier, which, by the way, many of these things can't be used because of deterrence issues. But it doesn't, you have to move it. And you also have to take on those who's, as I said earlier, who believe their jobs are related to the military industrial complex, or who don't want to change that complex, which is so deep. But I do think we should continue to kind of what this costs, what that costs, but maybe with new forms that can be more interactive, maybe. Because I do think outside, I say agitation in the best sense of the word, like creative dissenters, is needed to move some of these issues.
Wait on. I have to move in the chat. The questions are coming too fast, which is great. The next question is, what is the extent of European opposition to the escalatory role of NATO and the Russia-Ukraine war? What has been the role of the European Parliament and the peace movement in Europe?
So very interesting. At the moment, it's evolved. There have been more peace demonstrations in Germany, for example, than in this country around Ukraine. You do have the rise of the right, as we've seen in France, Germany. Interesting, I mean, not the far right, but like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany is an upstart party, which did well in the regional elections last month. And they're opposed to the war. But what's also leading to opposition in Germany is the deindustrialization of Germany, because its contacts with Russia were, you can argue they were not positive, but they were there. And I think NATO is on a different path. The EU is on a different path, seeing the danger of NATO expansion and military development doing the opposite of what NATO was supposed to do, which was keep Germany. It was supposed to keep stability, but it's not, because the right wing, which we're seeing emerge, is somewhat related to what's happening with the war in Ukraine. Most difficult is the Baltics. Do you remember during the war in Iraq? It's probably very kind of abstruse. Or there was old Europe and new Europe. Old Europe was Italy, France, Germany, UK, sort of. The EU represents much of that, but the Baltics and the Eastern European countries are very much, quote, like new. And so there's a battle between those forces too. it's complicated and it's not clear. And I think it is moving to a point where Europe is more eager to resolve than.
Okay. The next question has a bit of a prelim. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 is the governing international law between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus agreed to send the former Soviet nuclear weapons they inherited to Russia in exchange for Russia agreeing to refrain from the use or threat of force. NATO expansion was bad policy at the time. This person called it bear baiting, but in no way does it justify or excuse Putin's aggressive war on Ukraine.
No, I agree with that in the sense that I'm saying you have to understand how history informs this. I'm not saying it justifies it, but I also think the Budapest Memorandum, and I went back today to look at some explainers. It comes up on your screen quickly, but as I was trying to say earlier, Ukraine's weapons, nuclear weapons, were very old. They didn't have the operational system. It's kind of like a part of an empire strategy where the outlying republics, provinces had weapons, but they couldn't really be used. They were obsolete, old, etc. And, there was a kind of sense of euphoria. That was still, by the way, when the Cold War might have ended, where you had the United States. I mean, the defense secretary was over there with a shovel, like getting rid of weapons. But it was violated as in the way Ukraine has seen. On the other hand, would it be better if all these countries still had nukes?
The next one asks a question I think that's been bothering a lot of us. Most of the peace movement in the U.S. is not addressing Ukraine these days. Focus has turned, it doesn't say, but understandably, to the genocide in Gaza and widening Middle East war. How can we connect the two crises and bring the peace movement back together to work on peace in Ukraine?
I think that's such a critical point. I'm not sure it's with the Middle East. It might be with the nuclear issue, which is also afflicting the Middle East. But I think I was involved in a listserv for the international, remember the IPPNW, won a Nobel Prize, Bernard Lown, the physicians for nuclear sanity, physicians for, so that group is divided too. There's no question that peace groups are divided to some larger extent than we've seen on other issues, partly because this is Putin's aggression. Putin has been, and I'm not saying he shouldn't be, I'm just saying he's been demonized. Okay, we did negotiations with Stalin, who killed millions of people in the Gulag. I'm waiting for the day that there's going to be a cancel police at the Roosevelt House in New York when they take down Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. But I'm just pointing out that the demonization of Putin and the connection made with Trump has led a lot of groups, rightly or wrongly, to say we cannot do negotiations with that country.
Yeah, I wrote a short blog post for our website pointing to the negotiations over Kosovo with a bunch of war criminals headed by Slobodan Milosevic, who was eventually prosecuted despite the
Exactly.
agreement.
And that should be the goal, both especially South Africa's courageous role in around Israel, but the there's been a loss, I think, of understanding of what diplomacy is. It's a very stolid, kind of old-fashioned word, but what diplomacy is putting yourself in another's shoe, like cognitive empathy. Very tough, and people rightly turn away from it, but it's needed in many cases. They should, someday our international institutions, as I was talking about the UN, flawed but indispensable, will be made real by their usage. In the interim, I think it's important that they show life, as they have, certainly around Israel and the Palestine issue. But the obscenity of Israel actually attacking UN troops, peacekeepers, not new in some instances, and UNRWA, I mean, this shows a kind of a shameful ignorance of what a truly civilized, humane world looks like.
This is an interesting comment, probably doesn't require an answer. One person wanted to defend younger people because he has three and says they're concentrated on staying employed, paying off their student debt, and paying the rent.
I think that's real. On the other hand, my daughter, who's 33, about to have a baby, spends a lot of time in Louisiana, Alabama, and Arkansas doing death penalty and wrongful conviction work. That's what really, I mean, kind of, poor Nika went to the Soviet Union and Russia 30 times. She's still interested, but finds her own way.
Yeah, we got a couple more. We got time for one or two more. One question was, could we divest from or boycott companies that invest in war and refers to this As You Sow website?
No, listen, I was going to bring it up. I'm sorry I can't find it, but there's definitely, Don't Bank on the Bomb in Europe is quite active. It's linked to the fossil fuel divestment movement. And I think this relates to the freeze as well, where you get, you identify corporations that are producing key parts for nuclear weapons, and then you do a divestment, but also I think reinvestment, because take the money and use it so people can see what it can be used for. Alice Slater, I saw, was on the call, but yep. In New York and in various cities, New York City, there are resolutions on divestment. What happens is you don't see them coalesce, so they seem atomized. There are also a few good mayors. Every year I have a mayor this year from Waterloo, Iowa, write about abolition of nuclear weapons and resolutions they put through their town council. And I think it's important to find people where they are. But I haven't met a person who's intrigued by nuclear. Think of the fact, though, that in 64, I think it was 64, that ad with the nuke and the little girl and the daisies. A lot of people remember it. I mean, I wasn't old enough to, but that showed once and
yeah.
had an impact.
Yes, I've written that. Yeah, one time. I might add, just for our audience, many people are familiar with this. You mentioned Alice Slater, who was one of the more active people in
Indefatigable.
In the Move the Money in the Move the Money movement, which Brooklyn is a co-sponsor and participant in, and that's to get the New York City Council to vote on a resolution to cut the defense budget. And one of the things, we haven't put it in our official asks, probably because we've been asking for so long. One of the things I would urge is if you live in New York City, yep, contact your city council person and urge them not only to co-sponsor it, because it has enough co-sponsors. The problem has been they've refused to vote on it for several
Absolutely. But I also think the treaty, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, it shows strength and it shows a role for the global community. And I think that's worth continuing to find and focus on.
Okay, I guess we have time for one more question, and this is a big sort of, not quite sure. Some people might see it as a pie in the sky question, but it's a great idea if it worked. Do you see the possibility of the US and Russia understanding the extreme danger of nuclear war and giving up the nuclear arms race, agreeing to stop the madness of nuclear war and working for the common security of all of us?
All right. Now, listen, I'm usually the pragmatic, rational person, but I'm telling you, I worked for many years with Kai Bird, who just wrote Oppenheimer, with Martin Sherwin. And I have in my office a Nation issue from 1950, Negotiate with Russia, but I also have issues where you had the Baruch Lilienthal plan, which was to share the nukes. That didn't go too far, but that was part of the post-war. That was one of the post-war issues that emerged and was quickly because of McCarthyism, because you can argue from here to eternity that if Roosevelt had remained alive, there would have been more emphasis maybe on anti-colonialism than anti-communism. But you're not going to get a negotiated peace with Russia or sharing nuclear weapons in a really hot Cold War, as we saw after World War II, which, by the way, Cold War, and Rusty would know this, I mean, it started in the war. Anyway, yeah. But I don't think anyone should put aside something as pie in the sky. I think you can say it won't happen for many years. It may not be the thing to fix on politically, but I think you should always keep alternative visions in place and fight for them, not at the expense maybe of, immediacy, but yeah.
We do have a response from Alice Slater.
I see it.
That we got a New York City resolution to support the new ban treaty.
That's
So
terrific.
there is some good news there.
You mean the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons?
I assume that's what it is, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because there was also the divestment issue, which.
Yeah, that's
Thank
true.
you.
Oh
yeah, the proliferate, yeah, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Well, this is such an important issue. We could probably go on for another couple hours, but that's not such a great idea, I'm afraid. So again, thanks so much to Katrina.
Thank you.
A last round of applause.